Bill, and again, so good to be with New Horizons again. Even if it is on Zoom, it's still good to be with you again. Uh, the year is 1876. It's the beginning of America's Gilded Age, and we're celebrating our 100th anniversary as a nation. President Grant has opened the Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia at the time. And eventually, within a period of just 2 or 3 months, 10 million Americans are going to visit this fair where they're going to gawk at all the memorabilia that is brought there. Most popular, which is probably George Washington's false teeth. But the emphasis of the fair is not on America's past. Instead, the emphasis is on America's business and industrial progress and the bright future that's expected for America. The Centennial is all in the news. This exhibition is all in the news. It's a very interesting exhibition for Americans because there was a lot of new products that were introduced that are just very familiar to us today. Alexander Graham Bell, for example, he introduced his telephone at the time. Remington introduced what they called a typographic writing machine. Consumers, for the first time, could taste a new bottled ketchup rather than something from home. They were able to, for the first time, buy their beer from a can and drink from it. And a lot of people were really excited because they had their first banana. Even though their banana was pretty expensive, it came wrapped in tinfoil and they cost a dime each. An electric dynamo was demonstrated showing that artificial light could safely be brought into Americans' homes and business. And for those landowners that were especially concerned about land erosion, the solution was found and was introduced at this exhibition. And that was the new Oriental plant that had been imported, and that was kudzu. That was going to solve all the problems of erosion at the time. So it was a happy time. But unfortunately, by the time the actual centennial came around in July of 1876, tragic news is going to come from the Western frontier that's going to end all the smiles that had happened with the centennial. Just as the 1941 Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the 2001 Islamic terrorist attack on the World Trade Center is going to bring disaster and war to Americans, no less so is this 1876 disaster known as Custer's Last Stand. Of course, the United States, as you already know, had this massive Western migration after a bloody civil war. And so, of course, they came into conflict, the new settlers did, with the Plains Indians. So as settlers are passing through Indian land, as well as the transcontinental railroads are being built, it meant that there was going to be an inevitable clash between these two forces, particularly with the Lakota Sioux and the Northern Cheyenne, and that's going to climax in the 1870s. 1874, gold had been discovered in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory. And when that happened, thousands of prospectors rushed to seek their fortune. Now, there is no doubt they were trespassing. There is no doubt that this land where the gold was discovered belonged to the Lakota Sioux. 1868, there had been the Fort Laramie Treaty signed between the United States government and between the Sioux Nation, and that granted the Sioux all the land west of the Mississippi in what is essentially today's South Dakota. At first, the Army tried to enforce the treaty. And they tried to stop prospectors. They tried to turn them around at the time. Unfortunately, politics got involved. And President Grant made what was an obviously political decision. And that was that, well, no, don't try to stop them from trespassing. In fact, try to protect them and help them in their trespassing at the time. And so when he does that in November of 1875, obviously there's going to be problems. And then he follows that up by ordering that the Sioux and the Cheyenne had to report to reservations by January of 1876. And if they did not report by that time, they would be deemed as hostiles and therefore would be treated as a hostile nation at the time. Well, the deadline passes. A number of the Indians did report to the reservation, but there were also a number that did not report to the reservation. And when that happened, then Lieutenant General Philip Sheridan was ordered to begin a campaign at that time that's going to ultimately bring the 7th Cavalry into a violent confrontation with the Cheyenne and the Sioux at, of course, the Battle of Little Bighorn. This ensuing tragedy is really a shock to a lot of Americans when they get news about the Battle of Little Bighorn, because at that time, when you read accounts written at that time, most people didn't know there was an Indian problem. They thought that had all been solved. They thought most Indians were already defeated and had been placed on reservations. They didn't realize that. During the Civil War, for example, in 1863, the state of Minnesota had an uprising of Sioux Indians at that time, and they asked Lincoln to use the army to hang 303 Indians during that time. Lincoln, of course, thought about that a great deal, and he wondered how that was going to be viewed, particularly by European nations, if 303 Indians were executed by the American government. Particularly concerned about Britain and France, because again, remember your history, at that period of time in the middle of the war between the states, they still weren't sure if Britain and France might end up siding with the Confederate States during that time. So Lincoln made the decision. He wanted to go along and support Minnesota. Remember, he's got an election coming up the next year. But at the same time, he doesn't want to make things really bad with what was hopefully our European allies at that time. So he decides he'll choose the top 38 Indian leaders to hang. And so they do, on Christmas Eve, they do execute 38 Indians at that time by hanging them. Still the biggest legal execution that's ever taken place in American history. Incidentally, it's kind of a side. There was a real demand by doctors for these Indian bodies. They wanted them for medical studies. And so they didn't want anybody to know they were doing it. So what they did was they buried all the Indians that were executed in a mass grave. And then that night, they went and under cover of darkness, dug up all the bodies, and doctors just lined up to receive a body so that they could do studies at that time. So then Lincoln followed it up by expelling all of the Sioux from Minnesota and ordering them to go to what's today South Dakota or to Nebraska at this time. So with that having just happened the decade before, Americans, for the most part, thought there was no problem, that going west was not going to be a problem. They thought a lot of the Indian problem had been resolved. Now, you and I know that the Indian way of life had been totally disrupted from the moment that white European settlers appeared. If for no other reason than those settlers brought with them some new ideas of formal government, which the Indians did not have. The idea of private property, which was not something that most Indian tribes had. And the thought that production was the chief form of expression of a human's mind, and therefore cultivating the land, building things was considered very important. All of those were things that were kind of contrary to the Indian way of life at that time. Now, in theory, America recognized all of the Indian nations as being sovereign nations within the United States borders. That's true still today, because Article 1 of the Constitution speaks to that when it's talking about the powers of the Congress. And it says they have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So Indian tribes were viewed supposedly as sovereign nations within the United States border. After the adoption of the Constitution, things had gotten a little bit better for a little bit period of time. Unfortunately, that doesn't last, and it really became worse after the Civil War. Because remember, during the Civil War, the 5 major tribes, what's called the 5 civilized tribes, ended up supporting the Confederacy during the Civil War and actually being represented in the Confederate Congress. So once that happened, and then once that Minnesota uprising had come about during the Civil War, that had caused a change, a shift in a lot of attitudes that a lot of Americans had toward the Indian tribes. Let's talk about George Armstrong Custer. Custer, before his name became identified, associated with this vast defeat, and his name was thought of in heroic kinds of terms. Been born 1839 in Ohio, had a normal kind of childhood. Eventually, as he gets older, he's able to get an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he totally fails to distinguish himself in any way except as being good in horsemanship. In fact, his class was the class of 1861. Truth of the matter is there had been questions about whether George Custer would even be allowed to graduate from West Point. However, you may remember again, that class of 1861, with the war just starting, there was a vast, vast need for American officers. So the whole class was shortened. They were allowed to graduate early, and everybody pretty well graduated, including Custer at that time. So he's able to go on. Custer has a thing that he referred to as himself as Custer's luck. Custer does seem to be just one, until the end, just seems to have one of the luckiest lives around. He always seems to be in the right place at the right time. He also seems to be able to get the attention, a positive attention, of people who could help him advance in his career and in his personal life. And he would take any action he could to get attention. A good example of that, I think, took place in May of '62. He's with Union General Bernard at the time, and they had come to a river, and they are trying to find a shallow place to cross the river. And Bernard just is overheard by Custer saying, I wonder how deep that water is. Custer, hearing that, immediately, takes his hat, slaps the rear of his horse, charges out to the middle of the river, and the river rises up above his saddle, but Custer waves his hat to the general and says, General Bernard, this is how deep it is. Well, that kind of reckless action got the attention of Bernard and a lot of other people, and they were successfully able to make the crossing because of that. In fact, at that period of time, just a simple action like that might cause you to get a promotion, and it did. He got a promotion from lieutenant to captain simply by riding out into the water and telling him how deep it was. He's given a new command. Very soon after giving that new command, he does some very heroic things. First battle he's in, he captures 50 Confederate soldiers and takes them behind the lines. He also captured the first Confederate flag during the war between the states, which became national publicity. And he received a lot of congratulations from people. The commander, Major George McClellan, at that time, called Custer in, personally congratulated him, and said, you conducted a very gallant affair, and then made him part of his personal staff because of the rising star that was obviously in Custer. The press loved George Armstrong Custer. This is a time when you could kind of design your own uniform, and Custer designed a very gaudy kind of uniform. In fact, when he reported to his new command, his troops kind of made fun of him because of how gaudy his uniform stuff. But he ended up winning his troops over because, unlike a lot of officers, Custer always led the battle and always led from the front of the battle. He always led his men, and he wears this red flowing neckerchief, silk scarf that he wears. Pretty soon, his men all adopt the same thing. And if you serve under Custer, you're going to wear that red thing to let everybody know that you serve with Custer at the time. A lot of the things he will do make him appear reckless. I think restless too, but they're not like they weren't thought out. They may look reckless, but he tended to really think everything out about what he did. So 3 days before that important battle of Gettysburg, he's promoted to brigadier general because of the things that he had accomplished. He's a brigadier general in the volunteers. Now he's 23 years of age, and he's been made a general. He's one of the youngest generals that has ever come about at that time. Now, understand at that time, you could have 3 different kinds of ranks. You could have multiple ranks. You could have your actual rank that is in the actual real army. But then you could have a rank as being in the volunteers. But you should also have a rank that's like a brevet rank, which was a temporary rank that was given to you because of gallantry, bravery. Remember, at this time, there is no organized system of medals. And so a brevet rank was like a medal. So you might be promoted because you did something gallant at that time. So you could have all of these multiple ranks going on at this time. And he continues to do a lot of things. For example, right before Gettysburg, he's the man that's responsible for stopping the celebrated Confederate cavalry general and J.E.B. Stuart right before Gettysburg, which brings him a lot of credit. Now, so he performs admirably at Gettysburg. One of the most important battles in the history of America, obviously. But what's overlooked a lot of time is he lost 257 men at Gettysburg. 257 men died at Gettysburg while serving under him at the time. It was the highest loss of any Union cavalry brigade. But the press tend to overlook that massive kill of soldiers because of the gallantry he did. And Custer at that time is quoted in a letter that he wrote. He said, "I challenge the annals of warfare to produce a more brilliant or successful charge of the cavalry." So, Custer was not above tooting his own horn. But, a lot of you are familiar with that quote from the labor leader, John Lewis, who said, "He who tooteth not his own horn, the same shall not be tooted." Well, that's kind of how Custer felt. You needed to toot your own horn and let everybody know what you're doing. Well, after Gettysburg, the press just fawns all over this very flamboyant, what they now call the boy general, Custer. The New York Tribune wrote, future writers of fiction will find in Brigadier General Custer all of the qualities that go to make up a first-class hero. So, very famous guy with his promotion, with all this publicity, he wins a new bride also. Met a young lady, and very soon after meeting her, he's courting her, and he wants to marry her. Her name is Elizabeth or Libby Bacon. Her father is a very stern, serious judge. He finds Custer a little bit too flamboyant. He really doesn't particularly like him. But Libby is an only child, and she's, the apple of her father's eye. And so through all this massive publicity that Custer's getting, and with Libby, oh, daddy, please, please, eventually he gives in. And so Custer is able to marry Libby, who will proved to be very important in his life. Well, we said by April of 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee has decided to surrender, and he's retreating toward Appomattox, where he's going to do it. And here, Custer does one of those things that, you kind of wonder how much of this is immaturity on his part. But Custer, right before Appomattox, literally days before Lee is going to surrender to Grant, Custer rides into Lee's camp and demands that General Robert E. Lee surrender to him, not wait to go, but to surrender to them here. Well, Lee, of course, is just kind of taken back, and it doesn't even respond to him because it's just so classless, frankly, what he had done at the time. Lee's second command, Confederate General James Longstreet, just loses his temper and tells Custer, you're immature, you're out of order, and get out of here. Orders him to leave camp, says, if you don't leave, frankly, we're going to reconsider our surrender, and maybe we'll just continue to fight. So it was a kind of dumb thing that Custer did at the time. At the time, a number of people didn't know he'd even done that. Appomattox does come back by a couple of days later. Custer is at Appomattox, and his mentor there that we've mentioned before, General Philip Sheridan, actually gets the table that the surrender was signed on, as well as gets Lee's surrender flag, and presents those both to Custer's wife, Libby, and says, no man is more responsible for the Confederate defeat than General George Custer. So Custer is a very, very important man at the time, and a very well-known man. He's after that time, he receives a brevet promotion, and then becomes a major general in the regular army, as well as a major general of volunteers. Custer's one of those people that really needs war, and when the war is over with, things are not the same. And pretty soon, for example, all those people that had those temporary ranks, those brevet ranks, those volunteer ranks, are all given back where their previous ranks were. So Custer finds himself no longer a general, but finds him a captain, like most of the officers were at that time. So he's captain of the 5th Cavalry at that time. He's not popular with his troops after the war. He serves during the Reconstruction era for a while in the South. His soldiers really don't like him. You can understand this. Long, bloody war. It's peacetime. The soldiers want to go home. That's all they want. Custer, however, continues to, with all of this discipline, with all of this training, he's very harsh with his men at this time, telling them that they need to continue to be ready to fight. Most people in the Army, including his other officers, felt that all of these harsh disciplinary measures and training that he was doing was pretty well unnecessary. But Custer's unhappy. Now, you know, he liked being a general. He liked leading charges into battle. Now he's serving, just overseeing ex-Confederates in the Reconstruction South. And he begins to think, do I even want to stay in the Army? Particularly when he gets a great officer, a great officer from a Mexican rebel general who's fighting in Mexico at this time. And it's Benito Juarez. And he offers a generalship in the Mexican rebel army to Custer, and offers him $10,000 in gold if he will go to Mexico. Now, this is $10,000 in gold. You know, this is in, you know, the 1860s. That's a lot of money at that time. And remember, there is no income tax. So to get $10,000 is a lot of money. He actually went and applied for a leave of absence from the United States Army, planning to go to Mexico. Fortunately, his wife convinced him this was probably not a good long-term career move to join the Mexican rebel forces. And fortunately, his mentor also, Philip Sheridan, suggested he not do it. And eventually, he does get a promotion. A lot of it probably because they were afraid of losing him. And he is made a lieutenant colonel in the newly created 7th Cavalry. 7th Cavalry is not created till after the Civil War. So he's a lieutenant colonel there. And he takes places in some few exhibitions during that time. But then is a low point. He's separated from his wife. She's just several hours away. He decides he needs to see her. So he just takes off and goes to see Libby. When his returns, he's arrested for being AWOL at that time. And the Army ends up suspending him for abandoning his post, and suspends him from rank and from money, his salary, for 1 year. He doesn't serve that 1 year, however, because again, his mentor kind of comes to his rescue. Remember, because of what had happened in Minnesota, and because of things that are changing with the Indians, with people going west, General Philip Sheridan becomes very, very frustrated that his officers don't seem to want to be engaged in battle. And a lot of them probably didn't. They'd just gone through the Civil War. They weren't interested in getting involved now in a war with the Indians. So he wants Custer. He wants Custer to lead a campaign against the Cheyenne at that time. So despite this poor record of discipline, and beside the fact that he had been suspended, he's actually returned to duty after a few months. And he's leading the 7th Cavalry at this time. He does launch an attack on a Cheyenne village in November of 1862, a little village that was on the Washita River. The Cheyennes were, for the most part, outnumbered, plus they were caught unaware very early in a snowy morning, and many of the Cheyennes were killed. A few of the warriors were able to escape, and they did invade, fire back, but it was pretty much a major win for Custer. He killed 103 warriors and took 53 women and children prisoner, and slaughtered all the Indians' horses, over 870 Indian horses, so that they, of course, had to have those. And so he just killed all of those. So this is called the Battle of Washita River. And at the time, it was regarded as the first major U.S. victory in the Southern Plains War. And it did force a lot of the Cheyenne to go to the reservation after that time. But the term battle really overstates what occurred. And yet, very triumphant, Custer says there's not enough Indians in the world to defeat the 7th Cavalry. So he's very much very, very confident of what he's doing. He, 1874, he leads and goes into the Black Hills, supposedly looking for a place to build new forts. And he announces that he discovered gold in the Black Hills, which of course is going to lead to the Black Hills gold rush. So we're back to where we're starting. Thousands of trespassing prospectors being allowed to violate the treaty because of a political decision by President Grant. And so now the Army has been ordered to protect the trespassers at this time. Congress wants to know exactly what's going on, and they order Custer to come to some congressional hearings at that time. And he takes that time also to go to New York and get a biography of himself published. When he reports and does this congressional hearing, he's surprisingly very, very supportive of the American Indians. And he's very, very critical of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Very critical. Accuses them of a lot of corruption, out of a lot of them stealing a lot of supplies that were made for the Indians, but that they are stealing them. And one of the people that he directly attacks is the brother of the President of the United States, U.S. Grant's brother. And he accuses him of being corrupt. And when that biography comes out, it makes that same charge in it. In that biography, My Life on the Plains, as it was called. So U.S. Grant, as you can imagine, is very, very upset. Again, politicians are always thinking about re-election. And so he's very upset because now his brother has been accused of corruption, and hence he's part of the Grant administration. So Grant gets his supporters in the Senate to call Custer to the Senate so that they can question him. And when they get him there, he's accused of lying. He's accused of perjury. He's accused of degrading his federal officers. And then the Custer-hating Grant decides to retaliate even more. So he takes the command away from Custer for the upcoming Indian campaign. Well, this is something Custer desperately wants. And he pleads for this position and vows that he's going to change. He'll be different. He's going to be a more restrained person. Grant's ears remain shut. Sherman says, Custer, you need to make an appointment to see Grant. You need to go to Grant, apologize, beg for your command. Custer goes to the White House, goes to the White House. Grant refuses to see him. Writes Grant letters. Grant refuses to answer the letters. And Grant goes on to tell Sheridan, don't wait anymore for this Indian campaign against the Lakota Sioux. Replace George Custer as I order. And so they replaced George Custer with Major Marcus Reno. And remember that name, because certainly Reno is going to reappear. So Reno replaces him. Now, Sheridan, Sherman, they all still want Custer. They think he's the man for the job. But remember, Grant is the president of the United States. Therefore, he's the commander in chief. So they know they have to do what he wants. Eventually, however, Grant relents. Now, why does he change his mind? Again, probably because of an election probably also because he's being convinced we really do need Custer for this Indian campaign. That's the kind of officer we need. And he recognizes that this isn't going to be good for him. It's not going to be popular for Grant if the Indian campaign is unsuccessful and people find out that Grant had refused to listen to his senior Army officers about what they wanted to do. So he relents somewhat, but he does allow Custer to have a command in the 7th Cavalry, but he doesn't allow him to take the 7th Cavalry over. He just gives him a leadership position. Instead, General Alfred Terry is going to lead it. And then as assistant will be Custer. But Custer's warned, Terry's going to be watching you all the time. Now, the person immediately under Custer is Marcus Reno, who thought he was going to have the command. Well, Custer does seem to be more subdued for this time. For example, Custer was known for his long curly hair that would, when he was charging, would blow in the wind. And somebody suggested to Custer, you know, maybe you ought to cut your hair. So maybe you need to look more Army-like. And so Custer cuts his hair pretty close at this time. Doesn't satisfy his enemies, incidentally. Enemies write letters to the editor. When people praise him for cutting his hair, they write letters to the editor that say, he didn't, the only reason he cut his hair was because he was losing all his hair, because he's going bald. We saw the bald spot in the back, you know, so they're not going to give Custer any kind of break, of course. By this time, Custer's 36 years old. So the very elite 7th Cavalry leads Fort Lincoln in May of 1876. They're part of General Terry's army, and their job is to find all those other Indians, all those Sioux and Cheyenne that have not reported to the reservation. About the same time, there is an Indian holy man, a Lakota Indian holy man, who calls a gathering of what will end up being the largest gathering of Plains Indians ever. So Sitting Bull calls for this gathering of Plain Indians on the Little Bighorn River in what's today's Montana to figure out how can we keep from going to the reservation. This gathering, little by little, they begin to hear rumors about this gathering going on. The Army does. One of Custer's big problems is his command is divided in a lot of ways. He's got an inner circle of people that really like him in the 7th Cavalry, but an outer circle of people who really don't like him. And several of his relatives are in this inner circle, including a younger brother who's passionately loyal to him, and that's Tom Custer. Tom was also a hero. Tom was the only person during the Civil War that won 2 congressional medals of honors for bravery during this time. And Tom's an interesting character. There's biographies of him. He's a confirmed bachelor, very much a confirmed bachelor. He's also a confirmed ladies' man. But the truth is, both brothers, George and Tom, were kind of confirmed ladies' man. Certainly, George deeply loved his wife, Libby. But it was pretty well known that he was unfaithful to her. And he certainly demonstrated when it came to women a lack of self-discipline. That doesn't help him with those people that do not like Custer, because as they point out constantly, how hypocritical Custer is, how distasteful it is that he talks so much about this discipline, and yet he doesn't seem to have this. In fact, earlier in the 1860s, he had been accused of fathering 2 children by Cheyenne woman. Today, it's pretty well thought that's not true. That Tom probably fathered these 2 Cheyenne women, and the reason that's thought is because it's generally believed that Custer was sterile because of the venereal disease that he had gotten while he was at West Point. And of course, certainly he and Libby never had any children. All right, I'm going to talk about the battle, but I'm going to be blunt with you. I'm not going to give any kind of detailed description of the military tactics that took place during that time. The reasons are 2. One, because there's such vast disagreements, hundreds and hundreds of books talking about the military tactics. The second reason is more important, and that's because I'm totally unfit to talk about it. I don't have that military authority to be able to discuss those tactics. Instead, I want to talk generally about what's the outcome. Why do we think all of this disaster might have happened? June 10th of 1876, Terry sends Major Marcus Reno with 6 companies of the 7th Cavalry to go out on a reconnaissance to try to find out what is really going on with the Indians. He's given very specific orders, and Reno does exceed his orders. He was supposed to kind of only find the Indians. Instead, Reno, for reasons known only by him, decided to try to follow the Indians and to try to find an exact location. So he's gone for several days when he's supposed to have been back at camp. Well, he goes back with some pretty good information about the direction these Indians seem to be going. And Terry is willing to overlook it, but his immediate supervisor, General George Custer, is not willing to overlook it. He's very, very critical of Reno and says, you disobeyed your orders, you've exceeded your orders, and he gives him a reprimand at this time. The relationship between Custer and Reno was already strained. It's really strained now. Again, Reno expected to have the command that Custer now has. A couple of weeks later, June 25th, Army Crow Scouts report to Custer about a very large Indian encampment that's on the Little Bighorn River. Now, the Crow Indians had pretty much always sided with the American Army. And the reason is very simple. The Crow Indians were traditionally the enemies of the Cheyenne and of the Sioux. And so, in fact, the slide, which was taken on the battlefield a couple of decades later, shows you 3 of his scouts that were actually the Crow Scouts at the time. Now, General Terry is elsewhere out in the field, but he had sent some reports back, and in those reports, he told Custer, we think there's probably about 800 Indians encamped there on the Little Bighorn. Well, his estimates were way off. There were really about 7,000 Indians that were encamped there. Now, admittedly, most of those are women and children. 5,000 of them are going to be women and children. But there are 2,000 very elite Cheyenne, Sioux, and some Arapaho warriors at that time. The interesting thing about these Indians is that a great number of them carried 16 repeating rifles at this time. They carried 16-shot Henrys and 16-shot Winchesters. So they could shoot 16 times before they had to reload at that time. And they also, of course, had their traditional Indian weapons with them also. Now, Custer has got 566 men and 33 officers and another like 33 Crow Scouts that are with him. They carry single shot 45 caliber Springfield rifle, can only shoot one time before reloading. Now, the Army had made the decision to go with the Springfield rifles that shot only one time, rather than the repeating rifles that they could have been to, for several reasons. One, they were cheaper. Two, they were very accurate weapons shooting long distances. In long distances, they shot further, more accurately than either the Henry or the Winchester. And thirdly, they said if we allow the soldiers to have that many bullets, they'll waste ammunition. So if they only can shoot one bullet at a time, they'll be more careful and not waste their ammunition. So Custer's got his men. The average soldier's 27 years old. A third of them are recent Irish immigrants. In fact, some of them don't even speak English. A number of them really hadn't gone through a whole lot of training before they were put in the 7th Cavalry at this time. Now, Tom Custer is with George, as well as another brother who was a civilian employee. And Custer's brother-in-law was there. His nephew is also there. So Custer knows that has been ordered by General Terry to go and find these Indians. And the orders seem to indicate that he needs to wait until Custer joins him. But the orders that General Terry gave him were a little bit vague. And they were vague enough that they kind of gave an out so that Custer had some latitude to make some decisions of his own. Particularly this one phrase, which said from Terry, you're to follow the plans except if you have sufficient reason to depart from them. Well, Custer decides if the Indians are going to escape, that would certainly be sufficient reason for me to go ahead and to engage with them rather than wait. So what Custer decides to do is to divide his forces into 3 different battalions. Excuse me. Major Rhone is going to lead 1 battalion, got about 140 soldiers. The second one is led by Captain Frederick Benteen. He's got about 125 men. And then Custer is going to lead the third one, and he'll have about 225 men. Now, Reno's job was to charge at the southern end of this Indian encampment on the Little Bighorn River. Benteen was to go southwest with all their extra supplies, including ammunition and additional weapons, and to be there to cut off any Indian escape attempt. Custer is going to, with his men, go north and going to come down. And the idea is to have kind of a pincher movement. And they're going to have the Indians then to be caught between the north and the south. So he told Rhone these direct orders, that he was to cross the river, the Little Bighorn River, to move forward at as rapid a gait as you think prudent and charge the village, and you'll be supported by the whole outfit. So Rhone does that. But when Rhone starts his skirmish line, he feels that he's vastly outnumbered by the Indians. And so he withdraws. He doesn't continue the attack. And he grows across the river to a stand of trees. And then when the Indians begin to come across, he decides to go up these bluffs. So he heads in a very much a disorganized scramble of the soldiers up this bluff to try to set up a defensive position at the time. By this time, 40 of his men are already dead, Reno's men, and a lot of them are wounded. A number of them are just lost at this time. But he gets his men, sets up a defensive position up on the bluff. Gunfire should have alerted him that Custer was engaged in battle. Well, eventually Benteen comes and joins Reno. So why didn't Reno and Benteen go and help Custer? Reno said, oh, there wasn't any gunfire. We didn't hear any gunfire. However, there are other accounts that differ, because one of his officers at least claimed, I hear gunfire. Custer's in a battle. I hear him. Rounds up men, disobeys orders with Reno telling him not to go, starts heading that way, but meets so many Indians that he has to come back. Eventually, General Terry will end up joining them the next day. So they've got a combined forces between Terry and Benteen and Reno now of about 350 men. The Indians eventually set fire to the grass and they escape and all the fire and the smoke. But what's happened to Custer in this day? Well, it's all speculation. I mean, accounts are going to vary because there are no survivors except for Indians. And remember, it's like any large battle. Participants in the battle really only know about what's going on right around them. They can't see what's going on half a mile away during that time. So over the next few decades, Indians give various accounts. Various Indians give various accounts about what actually happened to Custer. And you know how it is with any historical event. As time passes, some people start recounting their brave exploits when the truth is they weren't even there at the time. So it's hard to get good, accurate accounts. A lot of people say, well, when Reno was in the north, coming off the bluffs, he would have seen Reno stop and form that original skirmish line, and thus would have gone ahead and attacked at that time, thinking Reno's going to come on and they're going to catch the Indians in between. Certainly by this time, he should have seen a large number of Indians. Custer should have. But he's expecting Reno to come. He had also sent by courier a note to Benteen saying, big village, come quick, bring supplies. And then wrote again, come quick. Well, of course, Benteen didn't come. Instead, he ended up joining Reno. The other thing is in a cavalry, if they did the traditional thing, in a cavalry skirmish line, every fourth man would hold the horses for 4 men, so the other 3 men could fire. So you immediately lose 25% of your firepower. And remember, they're giving 25% of their firepower to a superior force at that time. And then as the men holding the horses are killed, then the other soldiers either have to start holding horses or let their horses go at the time. So again, that furtherly reduces the cavalry's firing ability. So when the Indians would break through the line, pandemonium would probably have broken out. Some of the soldiers probably panicked. Others, of course, I'm sure, behaved courageously at this time. And as more of the soldiers are killed, then their weapons and their ammunition's on the ground. The Indians, of course, that didn't have rifles would have picked up the rifles of the dead soldiers and their ammunition. So what's the result? Well, the result of that is that the return fire from the cavalry is steadily decreasing, while the fire from the Indians is constantly increasing. So the end result is every soldier that's under the direct command of Custer is going to be killed. The ones that were only wounded were tortured and then killed at the time. The torture is a ritualistic killing. The mutilation of the bodies was horrendous because the belief by both the Cheyenne and the Lakota Sioux was whatever condition your body was in when you died, that's the way you went into the afterlife. And therefore, to gouge people's eyes out, to cut their arms off, to cut their legs off, would cripple them in the next life. So, Custer, every man in his command has died. Therefore, it becomes known as Custer's last stand. It's the next day before they go and actually discover the bodies. For 2 days, they really didn't know what had happened to Custer. Finally, on June the 27th, the surviving soldiers go. They try to bury all of the dead. They didn't have shovels. They didn't have spades. They didn't have picks with them. So they literally are digging by hand and using sticks and using their bayonets. So the soldiers are very shallowly dug. In fact, within hours after they leave, the soldiers' graves are dug up by wild animals. Their bones are spread around, as well as all of these horses, of course, that are like dead on the field. A year later, Custer's remains are dug up along with a lot of officers, and they're sent west. The enlisted men were not. They were pretty much dug up and put in a mass grave at the time. But Custer was buried at West Point. They think it's Custer. They don't really know. They still find remains today. Every once in a while, remains are still found. Custer's widow, Libby, just kind of ends up becoming a member of every American family at the time. She's going to spend the rest of her life defending Custer. There's all those questions. I mean, who's to blame? Why did this happen? Grant very publicly blamed it all on Custer. He didn't call it Custer's last stand. He called it Custer's massacre and said it was all Custer's fault. Most Americans didn't agree with Grant. Most of them ended up blaming Reno. Reno's accused of being a coward who didn't go and help Custer. Everybody knew Reno didn't like Custer. Frederick Benteen comes in for his share of criticism. He had been able to come and bring more supplies, but he didn't do it. He went and joined. Reno's career goes downhill in the military very, very quickly after this. So, in fact, in December of that year, he was charged with immoral conduct for making, while drunk, by making sexual advances on another officer's wife. The Army recommended he be dismissed, but President Hayes instead just suspended him for rank and pay for 2 years. So he demanded to have a public inquiry about Little Bighorn, and the court found him not guilty, the military court, but they pointedly didn't praise him at all. 4 years later, Reno's back in the Army, but he's court-martialed again for conduct unbecoming an officer. He was caught peeping in the window and looking at a fellow officer's young teenage daughter undressed at that time. So he's kicked out of the military. He marries. She divorces him within 5 months. His life just goes downhill. He ends up getting cancer of the tongue, and dies of that. He's buried in an unmarked grave. Incidentally, though, later on in the 1960s, a great nephew asked if they do another inquiry, and he was found. His dishonorable discharge was removed, and it was changed to honorable discharge. And his body, in fact, was moved to Little Bighorn, where he's buried. Frederick Benteen, he same thing. He was kicked out of the Army too for habitual drunkenness and disorderly conduct, and he dies. Fortunately, like I said, Custer had Libby, and she lives 57 years after Custer dies, and she continues to praise him. Wrote great books like Boots and Saddles, Tinning on the Plains, which are really, really good books. She never forgave Reno. She publicly said Reno was the only coward at Little Bighorn. She doesn't die until she's 91 in 1933. She's buried by Custer today. She always said her biggest regret was that she did not have a son to carry on Custer's name. So In closing, why did this happen? Why did this military disaster happen? Who's at fault? Could Custer and his men have been saved? Can we draw any conclusions? And I think we can draw about three. One, I think post-Civil War American Army on the whole particularly suffered from an overestimation of their abilities and had an arrogance of leadership. Why? Because they had defeated the Confederacy. And in that arrogance, they underestimated the American Indian. They underestimated the ability of the Indians to fight. And they kind of viewed the Indians with a fighting ability of contempt. That was a grave error. Secondly, the 7th Cavalry was frankly outmanned and outgunned. There were way more Indians with many better weapons than there were soldiers. That single shot could not compare to the single shot. And the third thing, the question, could Custer and his men have been saved? And the answer, I think, is perhaps. Certainly on the surface, Benteen and Reno seems to be more concerned about protecting themselves and their own positioning than protecting or supporting Custer. So I guess the question is, would they have performed any differently if it hadn't been George Custer out there? In many ways, I think Custer's personality sounds very much like 20th century George Patton. Those qualities that caused him to be successful may have been some of the same qualities that caused his downfall. But the truth of the matter is, regardless how the entertainment industry wants to depict him, Custer was not a drunken buffoon who didn't know what he was doing. He pretty well was doing the right thing. He just didn't have what he needed to do it. So the battle is super significant for the very simple reason that the death of George Armstrong Custer and the over 260 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry was viewed as such an incomprehensible tragedy that the average American demanded that something be done about the Indians. And what happened is, within 5 years of Little Bighorn, all of the Sioux and the Cherokees are confined on reservations, a system that didn't work then and still doesn't work today. So the battle signaled the ultimate defeat of the Plains Indians. And also, sadly, it reinforced all these stereotypes and caused a lot of hostility for days. The brave Native American warriors won the battle, but they lost the war. This was the greatest battle victory of all American Indians, but it ends up leading to their ultimate defeat. Bill, I think we have time if anybody has any comments or questions.
Well, I have a question. Have you ever visited this Little Bighorn in Montana?
Yes, several times.
Oh.
If you ever have an opportunity to do so, try to go very early. It can become very crowded. It's a very popular place. It is, but it's such a big place, you can be on your own. Most people just go to the museum and walk up to the monument, and they don't actually go on the battlefield. But you know, where various American Indians fell, where various soldiers fell, are all marked. It's pretty awe-inspiring to just walk the battlefield, and it's a very quiet place.
Your interest in American history, is that what led you to become as interested in this particular, George Custer and the battle, or was there, anything particular that you were attracted to about George Custer and this?
No, I kind of started like my big thing was colonial Revolutionary War history, and then that morphed into war between the states history, and then that Western migration is what happened. And I think the very fact too, Phil, is that as you see movies like Little Big Man and things like that that depict Custer as being an absolute fool and a drunk, made me want to kind of, is that real? How did he become that? And you end up finding a different kind of man. Like I said, most movies today depict him as a drunk. And the truth is he was a teetotaler. He didn't even drink.
From the military standpoint, and I know you're not a military specialist, isn't this very much a failure in intelligence that they didn't know how the Indians were moving? They didn't know how many Indians were there, the size of their foe.
I think that's an excellent point you made. Yeah, I totally agree. Just the fact that his intelligence there's about 700, 800, and there's 7,000. That's a vast difference. And again, once he divided, a lot of people want to attack him for dividing his troops, but that's what he had done before. It's what he did at Washita. It was successful by catching the Indians, in between so they couldn't escape. Or the term they used that time, they didn't call it escape, they called it skedaddle. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think anybody knew what he was getting into.
One point you make about the size of the Indians that gathered on the Little Bighorn, 8,000 Indians. At that point in 1876, wasn't it true that many of the buffalo had been hunted close to extinction even at that point, and that the life that Indians had led on the Great Plains, I don't know nearly so much as you do about this whole era, but didn't ultimately sort of, one of the ways they dealt with the Indians was just to sort of starve them to death. I mean, they left them, and that there were a lot of starving Indians ultimately, and that's sort of what did them ultimately in. Was this 8,000 Indians, were they actually able to sustain themselves in a place like this, or was this just a temporary,
Yeah, excellent point. This village, for example, there's 1,000 teepees, if you will, at this village. I mean, it's a big thing. It's over a half a mile. So it's a big group. Part of the problem, again, goes back to that reservation system that has been started. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, the buffalo by the next decade, by the 1880s, really is in bad shape. But so many of these Indians they were called roving Indians, and they would spend winters at the reservation and then leave in the spring. Well, that wasn't what the American government wanted them to do. The other thing that was happening with the buffalo is that when the Transcontinental Railroad came, it split the buffalo into two herds, the northern herd and the southern herd at that time. The biggest problem, the biggest problem that happens was the industrialization that went on to the east. It was discovered that the hides of buffaloes made great belts to be used. And so, yeah, the slaughter of the buffalo then is to get the hides, not necessarily to wear or for anything like that, but to send those back to let them go to make hides. So as America's industrialization increases, the buffalo just go down because the hides were better than, let's say, a cow's hide, for example.
All right. Are there any more questions?
Bill, I could, if I can recommend two excellent books if anybody's interested. And the reason I say I'm going to recommend two is because there are hundreds of books about George Armstrong Custer and Little Bighorn. But two that I think are extremely accurate and try to not be biased is The Last Stand by Nathan Philbrick, The Last Stand by Nathan Philbrick, and A Terrible Glory by James Donovan. Both of those are really good, and they both got some backgrounds that really help them, and including some military and intelligence background that's very helpful of that. So A Terrible Glory and The Last Stand, very readable books, very enjoyable books.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. I found this very interesting. I certainly know now a lot more about George Armstrong Custer than I did before, and we appreciate you coming to talk with us. Maybe at some point in the future you can give us another talk, since I understand with your knowledge, I'm sure you could talk on a wide range of subjects.
Thank you. No, I appreciate New Horizons. Thank you so much for inviting me. I always enjoy being with you.
Thank you for being with us, and I guess that will be it for today. And we will have Friday Forum on Friday for those that would like to join. As you know, our last week was our last session until January, and we will be giving you some updates by email over the next coming weeks.
Phil?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Larry. I think I want to take a minute to thank you for all you've done this summer and fall to keep this thing going. I think it's been an exceptional challenge, but to put it mildly. And I think you've done a great job, and not just you, but those who helped you. And I would name them, except I'd probably leave out somebody, but I know there are several people that have helped you with this. And thank you on behalf of me and others for what you've done.
Well, thank you. Yes, I would have to name it for those that were essential to making this work is one of our past presidents, who happens to be also my wife, Rowena Teague, and Kathy Rostand, who's been instrumental in communicating with everyone. And for anybody that's made any recommendations for speakers, we appreciate that, and we will be having some more meetings in the future, and we look forward. And I know, Larry, you've made some recommendations which have been very helpful. And well, we'll be seeing you here again before not too long. Thanks again.